Right. Well, we started the recording. Hi, everybody. My name is Susan O'Donnell. I'm the lead investigator for the Raven Project at the University of New Brunswick, and I'm also a member of the NB Media Co-op editorial board. So I would just like to acknowledge that we are in unceded, and most of us are in unceded and unsurrendered Willistuck territory. And we're very grateful for the opportunity to have this discussion today on this territory. I would ask that you, as I said, to use the chat and keep your microphones muted. And then we will have a Q&A session after Gordon's presentation when everyone will have a chance to have your questions answered, okay? So I will just Gordon now to share his screen and start his slide presentation and unmute himself, and everyone else stays muted and we can just listen to Gordon's presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm also a bit of a novice at this. Thank you so much to the sponsors. I'm very grateful to them. I think we're all very concerned about the push for small modular reactors, not only in New Brunswick, but in many different parts of the world and in many different parts of Canada, supported by the Government of Canada through the Natural Resources Minister. And as you know, there are three provinces which have announced that they would like to cooperate in developing small modular reactors. So in this talk, I want to just broach the subject of what is the background of all this? Where did this initiative come from? What does it mean? What kind of questions does it pose for us? And at least take a first step at beginning to answer those questions. There's a lot more to be said on these topics, and so we should continue the dialogue afterwards. I don't by any means suppose that I'm giving definitive answers, but just, you might say, first steps. Can my voice be heard okay? Is it clear?
Yes, Gordon, it's fine. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. So small modular reactors, I claim they're not clean, they're not small, they're not green, and they're not affordable. And I'd like to give you some background on this. So the introduction has to do with the status of the nuclear industry in the world today. Here is a graph from the World Nuclear Association, and it shows how nuclear reactors in the world, now about 440 of them, have plateaued for the last 30 years. There really hasn't been any increase, significant increase in nuclear reactors worldwide in all that time. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry, there's something wrong with my control. Oh, there we are. Okay, as a matter of fact, if you look at 1996, there were 438 reactors compared with 2019, only 4 more reactors. So, you know, they're barely keeping themselves alive, and they realize that. They realize that they're in trouble. They've realized this for quite a while, for at least the last 25 or 30 years. In 1996, those 438 reactors represented 17% of global electricity use, whereas today, almost the same number of reactors represents only 10% of global electricity use. So there has been a sharp and steady decline in the importance of nuclear in global electricity supply. And remember, electricity is only one slice of the energy pie. And so 10% of global electricity use really means less than 2% of global energy use. So when you think about nuclear replacing fossil fuels, you realize what an incredible task that would be. We're really nowhere close to that point in time. Sorry, am I going the wrong way? Now here's another graph from the US Energy Information Administration. It's mostly projections to the year 2050, but it starts off at 2010. And you can see even in that initial part of the graph, the green line representing renewables is so sharply growing, and they expect it to continue to be by far the sharpest growing curve on energy supply. So that if you look at the bar charts on the right, even in 2018, renewables in all their different forms were about 3 times more significant than nuclear. whereas in 2050, they expect it to be 7 times more significant than nuclear. And that's even with nuclear, well, there is going to be nuclear declining. It's going to go from 5% to 4%, according to what they're saying here, of total, their particular chart here. Now, the nuclear industry, realizing that they're in deep trouble, they launched a nuclear renaissance, and there was a lot of hype about this around the year 2000. Many of you might remember this. There was promises that there were going to be thousands of nuclear reactors, large nuclear reactors, ordered around the world, because we had now developed reactors which are superior, generation 3 reactors, even generation 4 reactors, which are going to be much safer, they're going to be much cleaner, they're going to be less expensive and quicker to build, because of course delays in building add to the cost and detract from the benefit. And so the trouble is that this nuclear renaissance was a gigantic fiasco. It just never took off. There was a collapse of the French giant Areva, the giant nuclear company. Through the one of the stars of the nuclear renaissance was the Finnish reactor, the Olkiluoto reactor, 1,400 megawatts. It was supposed to be operational, started in 2005, supposed to be operational in only 4 years. Quick building, right? 2009, at a cost of 3 billion euros. But the latest estimate is still not operating today. The latest estimate is sometime this month it might start operating at a cost of at least 8.5 billion euros. So here we have almost 4 times as long to build as promised and cost almost 3 times as much money as promised. And it has bankrupted Areva, which has now been dissolved and absorbed by Electricité de France, which refused to take the debt load. So the debt load has been really assumed by the French government, which really owned Areva and Electricité de France. Similarly, the bankruptcy of Westinghouse, another big project, 4 nuclear reactors down in the southern United States in Georgia and South Carolina. Westinghouse had to file for bankruptcy in 2017 because of $9 billion in losses from these reactor construction projects. South Carolina abandoned the project, the 2 reactors there, even though they had already spent billions of dollars on it. And Georgia is still trying to finish them, but it's a tough slog, and it's not clear whether they're going to be able to finish them. Through all this, the US federal government had given $8.3 billion in loan guarantees for the financing of these 4 reactors. Now, these loan guarantees are because Wall Street and the big banks, they will not invest, and they do not advise their customers to invest in nuclear projects. They're bad investments, according to them. And so consequently, in order to get the money for any such projects, they have to go to the government and say, will you please guarantee the loan? So what we have here is venture capital or risk capital with no risk. Who holds the risk? Well, the risk is the taxpayers. It's not their money they're risking, it's our money. And so that's what's happening with the small modular reactors too. The small modular reactors are looking to governments because they know that governments don't necessarily have to make a profit, and seldom do on such ventures. So if they can just get the government to fork over your money so that they can develop as they please, then they don't have to assume that risk. Now, the nuclear renaissance also led to a tremendous spike in uranium prices. You might remember this when there was a lot of exploration for uranium mining in New Brunswick and in many other jurisdictions. That's because the prices of uranium went ridiculously high and then collapsed right away again, because it was clear that the nuclear renaissance was simply not happening. So that's just another indicator of the fact that the nuclear industry is in the doldrums and shows no signs of getting out of the doldrums. Now, this graph only goes up to 2011, which is before the Fukushima triple meltdown. After the Fukushima triple meltdown, it went down even lower, and it sunk down to about $9 a pound for uranium now, which has forced Cameco, the great uranium giant, to close some of its most richest mines in Saskatchewan and to lay off thousands of workers. Here's the state of affairs according in November 2019, just a few months ago. the American Society of Mechanical Engineers wrote this in one of their journals. The state of affairs, the International Atomic Energy Agency, looking ahead to 2050, sees the most optimistic global electricity market share for nuclear as only 5%, down from the 10% today. So you see, when we were talking a minute ago about the 10%, that's ignoring the fact that most of these reactors are really old and they're going to be shutting down, and they're going to be shutting down much faster than any new reactors can possibly be built. And so that 10% is going to shrink to 5%. And in the United States and Europe, it steadily declines to between 3 and 5% of the market, constituting a potential for market failure. In other words, this industry is in danger of being snuffed out. And that's why they are really desperate. What we're seeing here is a desperate act on the part of the nuclear industry to really push hard to get the governments to pony up taxpayers' money to be able to launch a second nuclear renaissance. The first one was a bust. I used to joke at the time that the reason they want a nuclear renaissance is because they realize they're still in the dark ages. So this sense of desperation has led them to a second try, and that second try is the small modular nuclear reactors. They said, well, if people can't buy the big ones, maybe they'll buy the small ones. So back in 2016, for example, the Hatch Company was commissioned to do a study for the Ontario government, and they said that from an initial list of 90 small modular nuclear reactor technologies, imagine 90 different technologies. Each one of these reactor types that they're talking about are competing with each other. It's like a gold rush. It's like the Yukon gold rush. Instead of having prospectors, you're having these little nuclear entrepreneurs putting forward their favorite dreams of a nuclear renaissance on their own terms, and they're all jostling for the same bag of money and the same bag of opportunities. Only 9 were looked at by this report, and they were shortlisted for detailed assessment. And what they really talked about, I just want to point out to you that what they're really talking about here is for off-grid remote mines. That's what the real motivation is. The real motivation here is not to necessarily solve the climate change problem, but to assist the extractive industries. They want to use small modular reactors in the oil sands to get the bitumen out of the ground. They want to use small modular reactors in the Ring of Fire in Ontario to get these mines, to get those resources out. The mining companies don't want this. The oil sands doesn't want this. The nuclear industry wants this. And the government of Canada wants this. Why? Because the government of Canada basically created the nuclear industry. And they want to do it for political reasons because they have not been successful in trying to reduce carbon emissions quickly. The pipeline they bought, the oil sands progressing, the bitumen, and the fact that Doug Ford in Ontario has canceled all renewable investments, even at a penalty of over $200 million. So what can the government of Canada do to pretend to be solving the climate crisis? Well, they're saying, okay, we're going to bank on nuclear. But if you think about it, you realize that what they're really doing is they're kicking the can down the road because they can't get these nuclear reactors online for 10 or 20 years. So they're really saying we're not going to do anything for 10 or 20 years, but we're going to tell people we're doing something by throwing money at these nuclear reactors. There's where the Ring of Fire is located. There's all kinds of mining opportunities there. And the nuclear industry has always been looking for a rationale. It's a technology in search of a cause, and they're trying to hitch their cause to extractive industries and to the climate crisis. By the way, the Chiefs of Ontario, that's over 40 First Nations in Ontario, represented by the Anishinaabe Nation and the Iroquois Caucus, have joined together on the nuclear waste problem, and they have passed a very strong resolution demanding that the nuclear industry abandon its plans to operate small modular reactors in Ontario and elsewhere, and demand that the government of Canada cease funding and supporting this program. However, the National Resources Canada is pushing ahead with this Canadian small modular reactor roadmap, which they published in November of 2017. And they're really hoping that they can create markets for Saskatchewan uranium, which is in the doldrums, and for nuclear reactors, which is also in the doldrums. You may remember the failure of the CANDU industry. It was such a phenomenon that SNC-Lavalin bought the CANDU industry for $15 million and immediately received $85 million in government grants to proceed to try and sell the darn things. So the CANDU industry is pretty well dead in terms of opportunities. In fact, even nuclear executives of companies like Exelon are saying openly that there will never be a large nuclear reactor built again in North America. That's why they're going for these small reactors. It's really an act of desperation to try and keep the nuclear industry alive. And one way of trying to facilitate this is to stop emphasizing the word nuclear. Take it out, just call them small modular reactors, not small nuclear reactors. Let's try not to highlight the fact that this is nuclear energy, because nuclear energy poses very specific problems. If it was not nuclear, a nuclear reactor would be not dangerous at all. Even if a nuclear reactor exploded sky high, whom would it hurt other than the workers on site? It would not hurt the public. It would just be an unfortunate incident. The reason why nuclear reactors are dangerous is because of the radioactive waste inside. That's why. If the reactor explodes or is damaged or whatever, the radioactive waste can escape. And this can contaminate large areas of land and affect millions and millions of people. And that's why nuclear is problematic. Also, the nuclear waste contains the plutonium, which is the ingredient needed for nuclear bombs. And so the radioactive waste is also the key to the so-called nuclear weapons proliferation problem. These are the problems that make nuclear special, and these are the things which are not even mentioned in the promotional literature for small modular reactors. They simply talk about them as if they were just another generating machine, like a backup generator. You know, let's put a small modular reactor close to a mine, and they can use the energy. What about the radioactive waste? Well, we just don't talk about that. We'll get around to that later. Now, another thing the government could do to help speed the process, because the nuclear industry is also saying, hey guys, you government people, you better invest now because this is a hot market. And if you don't put your money in now, you're going to be behind the 8 ball, because other governments are moving ahead on this. The UK is moving ahead on this, and the US is moving ahead on this. And if you want to get in on the ground floor, you really got to hurry up. You know, get these things while they last, because they're not always going to be available to you. And so what the government of Canada has done is they have exempted all small nuclear reactors from any environmental assessment. They passed a new Environmental Assessment Act, which creates an environmental assessment agency, which is supposed to do all the environmental assessments that are to be done in Canada. And you're not allowed to do an environmental assessment except through this agency. Well, this agency has been given a list of projects which specifically excludes small modular reactors below 200 megawatts of heat, or any size if they're located on an existing reactor site. So if they wanted to build small modular reactors on the Pro, no environmental assessment. Even though I mentioned 90 different models a few minutes ago. There's actually over 150 different models now, all competing with each other, all vying for attention. There are 3 nuclear reactors being discussed specifically in Canada, 2 in New Brunswick, which are completely different models. One uses molten salt as a coolant and liquid molten fuel. The other one uses a liquid sodium metal as a coolant, and is a model after the fast breeder reactors that were built a long time ago. So, and here in Chalk River, Ontario, they want to build another small modular reactor, which is cooled with helium gas. All of these reactors are competitors with each other. They're all completely different. And none of them can make money unless they mass produce them. They have to sell them by the hundreds or thousands to even lower the cost down to where it's affordable. And what are the chances that one of those models is going to corner the market enough to make a profit? Highly unlikely. So the elephant in the room is the nuclear waste, which is the root of all the problems and which makes nuclear so expensive as well. As we know, uranium is the only element in nature that can be used to make an atomic bomb. There is no other element found in nature except uranium. And it's a particular type of uranium, uranium-235. And that's the only element which can also be used to produce energy through a nuclear reactor um, that is found in nature. Now, there's another element that can be used for both those purposes, bombs and reactors, and that's plutonium. But plutonium was never found on Earth before 1939. It was only when we started making it, and where plutonium comes from, it's actually it's a derivative of uranium. So uranium is the key element of all nuclear technology. And what is nuclear fission? Well, nuclear fission is when a neutron, a small subatomic projectile, strikes the uranium-235 atom. The atom actually splits into two or more pieces, big chunks, and those are called the fission products. And there are hundreds of different varieties. They all have different names. You've heard some of these names: cesium-137, iodine-131, krypton-85, strontium-90. These are all broken pieces of uranium atoms. So when the Fukushima plant, for example, gives off radioactivity into the environment, they're all basically broken pieces of uranium atoms that came from Saskatchewan, because they buy the uranium from Saskatchewan. So we send it over there, and they send it back to us as radioactive fallout. And while the energy is being released, because the strongest force in the universe is what holds the nucleus together, and so when you split the atom, you release some of that energy, but you also give off more neutrons, and that allows the possibility of multiplying the splitting very rapidly, and that's the basis of the atomic bomb, and it's also the basis for nuclear power, to be able to get a self-sustaining chain reaction. Like a self-sustaining fire, you light it with a match, and from there you let oxygen and wood take over to get a good fire. Well, here it's just you start it with a neutron, and you let the multiplication of neutrons carry forward to keep it going. Meanwhile, those extra neutrons create another category of radioactive materials called activation products, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So what is radioactivity? Well, most atoms that we experience are stable, unchanging, eternal atoms. Like an atom of hydrogen in a water molecule was around hundreds of millions of years ago, the very same atom. And nature simply recycles these atoms into different combinations. And those are most of the atoms that we deal with. But a radioactive atom is unstable. These atoms explode, they disintegrate, and when they disintegrate, they damage the nearby living cells, because they throw off a kind of a subatomic shrapnel, which is called atomic radiation. And it breaks the DNA molecules and other molecules and causes things to grow incorrectly, not according to the original DNA plan, but according to the randomly modified damaged DNA plan, which sometimes leads to cancers and sometimes leads to genetic damage to the eggs and sperm, which can be transmitted to future generations. The half-life is the time it takes for half of those atoms to explode. There is a small handful of naturally occurring radioactive elements, but there are many hundreds of human-made radioactive elements. And when the radioactive nucleus explodes, it gives off either a powerful photon of gamma energy, which is much more powerful than X-rays, very penetrating, or it also may give off a particle, a charged particle traveling with great speed, but not having nearly the same penetrating power. A beta particle will go several centimeters in soft tissue. An alpha particle will go a much shorter distance, just a few millionths of a meter. And these are called particulate radiation, alpha particles, beta particles. But they are very damaging inside the body. They're not so harmful outside. So we talk about radiotoxicity to refer to the inner hazards. When you get radioactive materials in your body, they irradiate you from inside and damage your cells from inside. And that's where the alpha emitters and beta emitters are most damaging. It's only the gamma that can really create a lot of damage from the outside. The beta can create a certain amount of damage, but the alpha is harmless outside the body. But it's much more dangerous than the other types once it gets inside. So gamma ray is like an X-ray, but more powerful. A beta particle is like I call it a subatomic bullet, which goes a few centimeters. The other alpha particle is like a subatomic cannon. It does tremendous damage, but only in a very short radius. So it's slightly penetrating, but highly damaging. And everybody says, even the CNSC and everybody else, that an alpha particle will cause at least 20 times as much damage as a beta particle or a gamma ray. That means it'll create 20 times as much cancer or 20 times as much other biological damage. So these are primarily internal hazards. You can see these things only in a special cloud chamber. This is a lump of uranium ore, and you can see the tracks made by these particles that are constantly being given off, but it's invisible to our eyes. None of our senses, we can't see it, we can't smell it, we can't taste it. Without special equipment, you would not know that there is any radioactivity at all. It just looks like normal material. And in fact, what the nuclear industry has done is created analogs of stable atoms, which are unstable. Non-radioactive cesium, which exists in nature. You know, before 1939, there was no radioactive cesium in nature, none at all. We created it. The strontium exists in the soil. It's not radioactive. We created radioactive strontium. And the trouble with these radioactive analogs that are created is when they're mixed with the non-radioactive material, they're chemically identical, and so you can't separate them anymore. You can't separate the radioactive from the non-radioactive. That's why it's so important to keep the radioactive material isolated. That's why we have a radioactive waste problem. Now, a can-do fuel bundle like this, if you can hold a fuel bundle before it goes into the reactor. Why? Because although it's radioactive, it's alpha radiation. The uranium is an alpha emitter, and consequently, alpha radiation can't even go through a sheet of paper, let alone the metal coating of these fuel bundles. So you can safely handle it if you should wear gloves and so on and not be there too long. But when it goes into the reactor, it comes out the other end. It'll kill any human being in 20 seconds at a distance of 1 meter because of the intense gamma radiation from the fission products. Those broken pieces of uranium atoms are so radioactive, they'll kill anybody. And in fact, once that bundle has been used in the reactor, it's called used fuel. It's the most radioactive object on Earth. And it will no longer be handled by human hands for at least the next 500 or 600 years because it's too dangerous to do that. It also has to be cooled for about 10 years in a pool of water. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So there are 3 categories of radioactive waste materials. There's the fission products, which I've talked about, and there are hundreds of them, the broken bits of uranium atoms. There's another category, very important, called the transuranics. These are heavier than uranium. The fission products are all lighter than uranium because they're broken pieces of uranium atoms, but the transuranics are heavier than uranium. And how they come about is that when the uranium atoms absorb a neutron but do not split, they become heavier, and they become very dangerous radioactive alpha-emitting materials such as plutonium and americium and curium, neptunium. There's about 36 of those that I could recite offhand, each one having different isotopes. For example, plutonium-239, plutonium-240, plutonium-241, plutonium-242, and so on. About 36 that are commonly mentioned. And then there's a third category called the activation products. Now what this is those neutrons, those extra neutrons that are given off, some of them go into the steel and into the concrete, and they encounter non-radioactive atoms in the structural materials and make them radioactive. That's called activation. What happens is a non-radioactive atom like cobalt-59 in steel will absorb a neutron and turn into cobalt-60, which is a very intense, powerful gamma emitter, and which becomes very dangerous for the workers. Now, because that's right in the steel, you can never recycle that steel. All that material has to be buried as radioactive waste. It's not recyclable. So some people have called nuclear energy the ultimate in the throwaway society because it's the absolute opposite of recyclability. And that's why even after you take the irradiated fuel out of the reactor, you still have a whole lot of radioactive waste left behind because the structures themselves have become radioactive. And by the way, that radioactive waste is not the responsibility of the federal government. The federal government has said they will look after the irradiated fuel, but you guys are responsible for all the other radioactive waste. So New Brunswick would be left with a legacy of radioactive waste from these small modular reactors, any of them that were left in New Brunswick or any other jurisdiction. Now here's a list of 211 radioactive materials in the radiated fuel. These are all human, almost all of them are human-made elements. There's a few of them that occur in nature to a very slight degree, but we create them in mass quantities. And there's 211 of them. I got this from Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. They're all in the irradiated nuclear fuel, and they all are very dangerous to living things because of the atomic radiation. And that list is by no means complete. They don't even know all of the radioactive materials that are created in a reactor. I've been told by nuclear engineers that there are over 1,000, really, and they've only really studied a handful of them. Nobody knows what all these things do and how they all behave in the environment. The face of a CANDU reactor loaded with fresh unused fuel bundles, this man can stand safely there because this reactor never operated for a single day. But if this reactor had ever operated, for him to stand there, he'd be dead as a doornail, because there would be a blast of gamma radiation coming off the fission product that would kill him in short order. The spent fuel is so radioactive that it generates heat and has to be cooled for 10 years in a pool. Now you might say, well, how can it be that hot? Actually, it's not that hot. The problem is not that it is hot, but that it generates heat. And unless you remove the heat as quickly as it's being generated, it will turn into higher and higher temperatures. The heat drives the temperature upwards. And if it's not cooled, the fuel will overheat, the metal cladding will melt, and radioactive gases, about 20% of the fission products are gases, and they will be released into the atmosphere as radioactive material that is going to damage the surrounding people and vegetation and so on. So we have two main categories that people talk about in the irradiated fuel. There's the fission products, the broken pieces of uranium atoms, and the transuranic elements, the most famous of which is plutonium, which is also the key ingredient in modern nuclear weapons. Even the H-bombs require plutonium. When they talk about dismantling a nuclear weapon, what do they mean by that? Well, what they mean is they take the plutonium out of the weapon. If you take the plutonium out of the weapon, it's no longer a nuclear weapon. It cannot be used as a nuclear weapon. So it's the plutonium that really drives the whole nuclear weapons arsenals of the world. And plutonium is created inside the reactor when a neutron strikes a uranium-238 atom. It absorbs the atom, the neutron, and becomes a little heavier and turns into plutonium-239. And that's the stuff that is really what bomb makers love to use for their bombs. Now, if that material gets into the hands of criminal organizations or terrorist groups, then we could be faced with a very terrible situation around the world where, as somebody said once, Reagan, in the Reagan administration, he said that we could wake up tomorrow and find Washington, D.C. gone and not have a clue who did it. Because you could make an atomic bomb the size of not much larger than a soccer ball. You could put it in the trunk of a Volkswagen and park it in a downtown city and explode it by remote control, and it would be more powerful than the Nagasaki bomb that was used in 1945. So the idea that this stuff would be readily available is a kind of a nightmarish prospect, and it's one of the worst aspects of nuclear power in terms of if we got to the point where plutonium is readily available and is in wide circulation, this would be very, very bad news for planet Earth because of humans. Now, at the present time, this is not done for the most part, and so the CANDU fuel that's used for LaCroix, for example, nobody can make a bomb out of that because it's not weapons usable. However, if you were able to get the plutonium out of the spent fuel, the used fuel, then you could make a bomb from that. And that's where the danger is. Now, in Canada, we have decided not to access that plutonium, but to bury the irradiated fuel with the plutonium inside, something which the nuclear industry hates to see because they say, what a shame. We could get that plutonium and use it for peaceful purposes, for nuclear fuel. This is how much plutonium is needed to destroy a city. That is a glass paperweight, which is made to be exactly the same size and shape as the plutonium ball that was in the Nagasaki bomb. It's only a few kilograms. And now they say that that's about 6 kilograms, by the way. And now they say that with modern designs, you can do the same, get the same degree of destruction with half as much plutonium, 3 kilograms, more efficient bomb design. So in Canada, we talk about burying this waste, and all over the world, they talk about burying this waste. Why? Well, because it's so bloody dangerous. This is a graph from a 1978 report from the Royal Commission of Electric Power Planning in Ontario. And this graph shows the toxicity, the radiotoxicity. That means the ingestion toxicity. If you were actually able to get this into your body through eating contaminated food or drinking contaminated water or inhaling contaminated air, the question is, how toxic is it over a period of 10 million years? And the way they went about this, they said, well, let's look at one CANDU reactor and look at just 1 year's worth of spent fuel, 1 year's worth of irradiated fuel. So think of 1 year from Point Lepreau, for example, the irradiated fuel. The blue line represents the total toxicity. And the way they did this is they said, well, you know, there's a limit on how much of this stuff you can put into drinking water. We have limits for every one of these radionuclides, how much the maximum amount you're allowed to contaminate the water with. How much water would you need to dilute all this stuff to the maximum level of contamination permitted? And at the top on the left, that amount of water would be about equal to the volume of Lake Superior in order to dissolve it down to the maximum legal level of contamination. And as you progress, the toxicity declines. But after about 50,000, by the way, after about 500 years or 600 years or maybe 1,000 years, the fission products, which is the red line, become less important than the actinides, the transuranics. And so the toxicity remains much higher than the fission products after about 1,000 years. That's because the transuranics are much longer lived and so on. Now, these small modular reactors that they're planning for New Brunswick, they say that one of the advantages is that it can reduce the inventory of plutonium by burning it up. And that will make the length of time needed to look after this high-level waste shorter. It will reduce it to hundreds of years instead of thousands of years. It turns out that's not entirely true. In fact, many of the things the nuclear industry says about such matters is not entirely true. One of the things I found distressing as a scientist is they don't seem to be able, or they can't afford to tell the whole truth. And so they only tell part of the truth. And I'll refer to this in a minute. Because small modular reactors are not clean. They produce radioactive waste of all kinds, and that means the irradiated nuclear fuel that we just talked about, as well as the activation products, which are in the actual structural material. So even after they take out the high-level waste, these machines are going to be radioactive themselves, and they're going to be constituting a source of radioactive waste, which is, how are they going to handle that? They say not one word about it, not one word. It's a form of nuclear energy that cannot be shut off. That's why we have a nuclear waste problem. We don't know how to shut it off. And we don't know how to eliminate it. However, it's not true that, that by burning up the plutonium and the americium and the transuranics, that you're going to eliminate the need for long, multi-thousands of years of storage. Because some of the fission products have half-lives of over 100,000 years. I've listed some of them here. And those things are going to remain dangerous. They cannot be burned up. And as a matter of fact, by burning up the plutonium, we're actually increasing the amount of this stuff. Because the only way you can burn up the plutonium is by splitting the plutonium atoms, which means you create more fission products. Moreover, the fuel for the small modular reactors has to be enriched fuel. Here in Canada, we use natural uranium, which has less than 1% uranium-235. These small reactors are going to have at least 5% uranium-235 and possibly as much as 20% uranium-235, which means the irradiated fuel is going to be much more radioactive than the CANDU fuel, because there's going to be a lot more fission products. And add to that the splitting of the plutonium atoms, that just adds to the inventory. So you're going to have a much more serious problem with the small modular reactor fuel, transporting it, for example. So small modular reactor fuel is always enriched, unlike CANDU fuel. Enriched fuel can cause, that's another problem. When you have enriched fuel, it can cause a criticality accident underground. What does that mean? Well, it means that when water comes in contact with enriched uranium, the uranium can spontaneously start splitting, undergoing a spontaneous nuclear chain reaction. That's called a criticality accident. Now, it turns out that that's not possible with CANDU fuel because CANDU fuel is unenriched. And the only way you can get a chain reaction going with CANDU fuel is to use a special kind of water called heavy water. If you don't use heavy water, you will never get a chain reaction going. But with enriched fuel, ordinary water, the kind of water that we use all the time, will get a chain reaction going. So this poses special problems for burying it underground. It means that you may have serious problems. In addition, the small modular reactor fuel that Moltex wants to use for their SSR, stable salt reactor, is based on salt, which is very corrosive. If you put salt, and by the way, the fuel is liquid, it's actually a liquid solution of salt with uranium. If you put that stuff underground, then you have introduced a corrosive agent, which shouldn't be there because it's going to compromise the stability of the whole storage capacity. Also, small modular reactor fuel can contain dangerous materials like sodium metal because the ACR 100 reactor uses liquid sodium metal as a coolant. Now, as anybody who knows who studied science, sodium reacts violently upon contact with air or water. And so having traces of sodium down there is also very dangerous. There's a paper called Burning Waste or Playing with Fire, which raises these points in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. I've given the reference there. Alison McFarland was chair of the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and she's a geologist, and she knows what she's talking about. This is the kind of facility they want to build to store this radioactive waste. Nobody knows whether it's really successful or not because we have no way of testing it. We have no way of knowing whether the waste, when put down there, is going to stay there. We've had 3 geological disposal sites which have failed in recent years. In Germany, there were 2 of them, the Assa 2 salt mine. They're now taking the radioactive waste out of the Assa salt mine at a cost of 3.7 billion euros, which is about $5.4 billion Canadian dollars. They're going to take the waste out of it because it's been leaking into the groundwater and into the surface waters, and it cannot be left there. And it's going to take them 30 years to do it, and it's a big mass. And once they get it up on the surface, they still don't know what they're going to do with it finally. And there's also been another one, the Morsleben report in Germany, which has failed. And in Carlsbad, New Mexico, they had a drum of waste underground, plutonium-contaminated waste, which exploded and turned into a flamethrower because of chemical reactions due to the organic kitty litter, which was used as packing material. And the plutonium went 750 meters vertically upwards, contaminated 22 workers, and drifted downwind. And that was only a few years ago. So these deep geological repositories, they sound great on paper, but are they actually safe? We don't know. There has been not one approved for use anywhere in the world. Finland is the closest. They've actually built a repository called Onkala, but it hasn't been licensed yet. So now here's another thing, is that both the ACR 100 and the Moltex SSR, stable salt reactor, these are the 2 models they're planning for New Brunswick. They both plan to reuse the spent CANDU fuel. They brag about this. They say, we can burn up your waste. But the only way you can reuse a radiative fuel is by accessing the plutonium. That's the only way you can do it. And accessing the plutonium, that raises security risks worldwide because they want to, in order to be successful, they have to sell these reactors in other countries. The domestic market is not anywhere possibly able to support such an industry. They have to be able to sell them in Africa, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, all over the world. And if you have reprocessing, a way of accessing the plutonium in the irradiated fuel, this raises serious problems about the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And who's going to inspect all these sites? Thousands of sites in remote communities and mining sites and so on. Is the International Atomic Energy Agency going to be able to send inspectors to keep an eye on all these things? Who's going to be watching the shop? There's another article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist called Reprocessing Revisited, Arms Control Today. It's actually from the Arms Control Today publication, not the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, sorry. And they say that proliferation-resistant reprocessing, which is what the industry is calling it, is an oxymoron. There's no such thing. Reprocessing also requires more transport of spent fuel, and to transport even a small amount of spent fuel requires a shipping flask of at least 70 tons. And who says that in these remote communities that you can ship the roads? Are the roads sufficient to be able to ship 70-ton and 100-ton and 200-ton flasks of irradiated nuclear fuel? Well, that's problematic. Also, the small modular reactors are not small, although they're called small. This is what the ACR 100 reactor design looks like according to the promoters. And what they've done is they've put as much of the components as possible inside the reactor core so that you have less possibility of things escaping by random leaks and random pipe breaks and so on. But when you put it all together, this is what they say it's modeled on. The ACR 100 is modeled after the EBR-2. The EBR-2 was conceived and built back in 1964. So 1964, how's that for a new technology? They're really reaching back into the past and dusting off old ideas and presenting them as if they're brand new breakthroughs, when in fact they're very old ideas that have all been tried with various degrees of success or failure in the past and have been rejected for various reasons in the past. Anyway, the EBR-2, EBR stands for Experimental Breeder Reactor. And it was the successor of EBR-1, which is the first experimental breeder reactor, which had a partial meltdown in 1955 and was retired in 1964, which is the year that EBR-2 started up, and operated without a meltdown for 30 years, to be honest. But this was on a military site where there were people, a very heavy security and so on. It's not on some remote mining site or some remote indigenous community or some remote exploration community. They actually built a prototype fast reactor in the United States. It was called the Fermi 1 reactor, and it generated only 69 megawatts of electricity. These are small reactors. You know, it doesn't look very small, does it? And they're not small in terms of their effects. And there was a partial meltdown in this reactor in 1966, as told in the book We Almost Lost Detroit. All of these reactors I'm showing you, the EBR-1, the EBR-2, the Fermi 1, and the NRX reactor in Canada, which melted down in 1952, these are all small reactors. The NRX reactor that melted down in 1952 was only 10 megawatts of heat. That's small, but it's very big in terms of the consequences. It underwent a series of explosions and a partial meltdown, the first major reactor accident in the world. So sodium leaks are also a problem because sodium reacts violently on contact with air or water, and all of the breeder reactors using liquid sodium coolant around the world have been problematic in that regard. Most of them have had sodium leaks and fires. The Clinch River breeder reactor was canceled by President Carter because if it underwent an accident, it could have contaminated 3 states out of the United States. The Superphénix breeder reactor was canceled by France because it's also a liquid sodium metal cooled reactor because it would contaminate almost the whole of France. And unfortunately, they just couldn't get it operating in a way that was sufficiently safe to be confident. So there's long-standing concerns as well, as I said to you, about the plutonium economy. And breeder, the word breeder means that it uses plutonium and breeds even more plutonium. So a breeder reactor is a reactor that uses plutonium and creates even more than it uses.
Gordon, hi.
It's out of time, are we?
We're getting there. I'm
okay.
just a reminder.
I'll just quickly go through the rest of this. What time are we at now?
45.
Okay, fine. I'm just going to go quickly through the rest. This Moltex stable salt reactor was also tried before, and it is also problematic. Not so small once you get it fully assembled. SMRs are not green because they take too long. They're too long. Climate action is needed now. The UK House of Lords reported in 2017 that they couldn't build a prototype small modular reactor before 2030. And the same thing goes here. They've used 2030 in their literature. So what we're doing is we're bypassing energy efficiency and renewables, which are faster and cheaper, and we're putting money into these reactors which cannot do any good at all, even at a prototype level, until 10 years, and it'll be 20 years before you can get any deployment. So we're kicking the can down the road again and saying, now Germany, on the other hand, more than doubled its offshore wind power capacity in 1 year, 2,300 megawatts of offshore wind. That would be equivalent to 2 large American reactors or 4 Pickering reactors here in Canada. We couldn't do that in 1 year, but you can do it with wind. SMRs are not affordable. As I mentioned before, you have to get hundreds of thousands of them sold, and they don't have any buyers. They have no buyers on their books. They're trying to create a market. That's why they're running around the country talking to people. They want to get people interested in buying these things. Right now, nobody wants them. And the trouble is that when you dismantle these small modular reactors, putting the small modular reactor into a remote site is going to be relatively easy, but taking it out is going to be damn hard because it's so radioactive that it requires a great deal of shielding, very heavy containers, and it's very, very dangerous. And what's more, the building itself becomes radioactive. What they're now trying to do, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, is trying to say, well, we can just bury it on site. But I have a list here of radioactive materials that are in the structural materials. These are not in the irradiated fuel. These are in the steel and the concrete and in the structural materials, which are going to be left behind. And you will notice that a whole lot of them have very long half-lives. In fact, of the 34 radionuclides indicated, 22 of them have half-lives over a century, 18 of them have half-lives over 5,000 years, 14 have half-lives over 100,000 years, and so on. These are not short-term problems. These are long-term problems. They're going to be leaking radioactivity into the environment for thousands of years. If you just bury them on site and leave them in those remote communities, turn your back on them and just say, okay, we're not even going to look at this anymore. It's not our problem anymore. So this is the end, and thank you for your patience, and I almost made it for 45 minutes. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Gordon. We're very, very pleased to have you. And now we can move on to some Q&A. And I just want to check, was there any? Okay.
Just about the,
Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. One of them was, just to clarify, you said that the government basically organized things so that small modular nuclear reactors are basically exempt from, or the one, if it's built next to La Pro anyway, would be exempt from an environmental assessment review. Maybe could you just say, like, is that a fait accompli, or is that something that can be challenged at this point? Oh, you're on mute.
I have to unmute myself. Yeah, this is a fait accompli. When the bill was passed, the First Nations in Ontario wrote a letter to the Senate saying, do not allow first small modular reactors to be exempt from this. They already passed a resolution opposing small modular reactors in general. But the idea that it would be exempted from environmental assessment is a fait accompli. It's not in the legislation, but they have a project list. All the projects that are on that list indicate whether something is going to be subject to environmental assessment or not. The law says that if there's any environmental assessment done of any kind, it has to be done by the Environmental Assessment Agency. But the project list says that small modular reactors that generate less than 200 megawatts of heat anywhere in the country, or small modular reactors of any size, if they're on the site of an existing nuclear reactor, will not need any environmental assessment whatsoever. And in fact, if the CNSC, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, who, by the way, lobbied for this to take place, they want these things off the list. They don't want it to be subjected to environmental assessment. And part of this is just to speed up the process. But bear in mind that we have 150 different models. They've already looked at about a dozen of them, and they've done pre-licensing evaluations. They're all different. They all pose very different technological problems, environmental difficulties, and so on. None of them will be subject to environmental assessment unless they're unless they're more than 200 megawatts and away from an existing nuclear site.
Okay, and I'm going to move on to other questions, but I just wanted to clarify because I just got a note that when they built La Pro, there was an environmental assessment required for the large reactor. It's just specifically because they're the small modular nuclear reactors that they're exempt and then would be next to La Pro, right?
Yes, and of course that was a completely different legislation. That was 2 Environmental Assessment Acts back. There was a 2012 Harper Environmental Assessment Act, which put the entire environmental assessment right in the hands of the CNSC, who, by the way, has never once in its entire history ever refused to grant a license to anybody. They are conducting environmental assessments right now for certain nuclear waste dumps. But in the future, with the new law that the Trudeau administration has put in, these small reactors have been specifically exempted from environmental assessment.
Okay, we have I have 2 questions, but the first one actually, I know, Gordon, when we spoke earlier, you explained that you were working with a coalition. You mentioned the Chiefs of Ontario and the Iroquois Caucus, I believe you called it. Yeah. And then you mentioned you showed us the letter that the Chiefs of Ontario had written. Would you give any kind of guidance? And I know you're probably going to be talking with Chief Hugh Akagi. I know he's reached out to you to talk about what's happening or what could be happening in La Pro. But could you give some guidance here? There's some people here on the Peace and Friendship Coalition who would potentially be mobilizing and supporting Indigenous voices against these developments. What would you advise that could happen at this point?
Well, I think it's very important to be really respectful of Indigenous people and not to even begin to suggest that you're telling them what to do or suggesting what they should do. I think the important thing to do is to act as an honest broker, to explain to them as honestly as you can what is known about these things, what the advantages are, what the disadvantages are, and let them make up their own mind. Now, we had a recent victory from the environmental movement point of view in Ontario, where the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation voted against a deep geological repository right beside Lake Huron, less than 1 mile from the lake, for all of the low and intermediate level waste, which is the other kind of stuff, by the way, that New Brunswick would be stuck with because the federal government won't take that off your hands. And they voted against that because it's on their traditional unceded territory. And the main reasons they did that was because of the sacredness of the water, which is the lifeblood of the planet, and for which Indigenous people have all kinds of ceremonies and prayers and dances and so on, and legends about the very important, great importance of the water, and also the sacredness of the earth. And so I think Indigenous people, they just need to be assisted in answering their questions honestly, and letting them advise what they think should be done.
Okay, thanks. And I know there'll be some follow-up later, so thanks for that. Okay, so we have a couple of technical questions. So Colin is asking, what's your proposition for baseload? Renewables are not dependable enough for a baseload, and we don't have the technology to store that kind of energy. How do you propose a baseload energy source? Do you want to take that?
Yes, well, there are many people who think that we can possibly move to 100% renewable, which may or may not be possible. But I think that anybody who looks at the economics even and the speed of deployment would see very clearly that energy efficiency is both a lot cheaper and a lot faster than any form of new source. But renewables are also quickly deployable. They are expensive, but they're cheaper than nuclear, and they're coming down fast, whereas nuclear keeps going up. The renewables keep coming down. They've already crossed over. So the thing is that you should go for the quickest and cheapest things that you can that's going to more quickly and efficiently reduce carbon gases, carbon emissions, and that's these renewables. Now, to the extent that we're successful in doing that, then we can talk about whether we can achieve 100% or 90% or 80% or 70% or whatever. But only then should we be talking about how to fill in the gap, because we know what is the best thing to do for the short term. Now, baseload is probably an antiquated idea. It's sort of like mainframe computers. Mainframe computers have been obsolete in the sense that portables and laptops can use mainframes as a kind of an accessory, but you don't. The power should be on the laptop. That's what the founder of Apple said a long time ago. In a similar way, baseload is based on old technology. If we use new technology with so-called smart grids, the renewables are dependable enough. At least we're working towards it. They're not yet there, but they're getting there rapidly. And the breakthroughs in storage, such as in Australia, I could send stories to people. Utilities like Pacific Gas and Electric are now using industrial scale Tesla batteries, which instead of diesel backup generators for peaking, they're using these batteries instead. And that's the direction we should be going. Even if you talk about any form of storage, for example, nuclear guys, the nuclear proponents, they like to say, well, we could produce hydrogen from nuclear. Hydrogen is a storage system. You know what I mean? Hydrogen fuel, right? But the point is that if you solve the storage problem, to the extent that you've solved the storage problem, that will automatically favor the renewables rather than nuclear. Because the only present disadvantage of renewables is the storage problem. So if we wanted to make hydrogen, for example, it would make a whole lot of more sense to use solar and wind to produce that hydrogen as a vehicle use, rather than to use something like baseload electricity, which is downright stupid. So I think that the baseload problem is resolving itself. The more we build nuclear, the more we lock ourselves into this antiquated paradigm of baseload electricity. Solar and wind, together with storage and together with energy efficiency, which is number one, can go a long way towards reducing the need for this baseload concept.
Thank you. And I do have another question coming up, but I'd just like to remind everyone that you can use the chat to ask a question. Okay, the next question from Brian Lowry. He says, a lot of the problems with structural waste are caused by poor choice of materials, but there don't appear to be any workarounds, even with better choices. Is it correct to suggest that there's probably no solution to the structural waste problem?
I would say absolutely there's no solution, because they have worked very hard. They use zirconium because it's a lot better than certain other things. They use beryllium in making the fuel bundles because beryllium is basically invisible to neutrons. They've taken great lengths to try and find structural materials, as you say. But the result is that you have some of the finest stainless steel in the world has gone into the point in the pro reactor. And that stainless steel will never be able to be recycled and reused again. It's going to have to go into the ground as radioactive waste, because the radioactivity is right in the atomic structure of the steel. It's not just it's not a surface contamination only. It's an actual transmutation of elements into radioactive varieties. So yeah, this is an unsolvable problem at the present time, and it will also be a problem with fusion reactors. Although fusion reactors would not create high-level waste, which is a great big plus for fusion reactors, it will create probably even worse problems in terms of activation products, because the neutrons from fusion are 14 million electron volts compared with 4 million electron volt neutrons for fission. It means you're going to have a lot more problems that way.
Okay. Do you think nuclear reactors should be shut down before their planned end of life, even if it means what? Even if it means burning fossil fuels for power, etc.
No, I wouldn't necessarily say so. I think that would have to be done on a case-by-case basis. I think if it was possible to shut them down and replace them with renewables, for example, in Ontario right now, Premier Ford is paying $250 million in penalties for canceling all the renewable energy contracts that were already signed to build renewable energy. And he's spending billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, to rebuild the cores of old nuclear reactors instead of buying surplus hydropower from Quebec. which is non-carbon generating and which is available at about half the price. There's a lot of bad choices being made here because politics is politics, and politicians are often more interested in pleasing their supporters rather than, and in making political hay, rather than in doing what is the best thing for solving the problem. In this case, the energy problem in Ontario, the Pickering reactors are being run into the ground, and the Darlington reactors are being refurbished. And a lot of that difficulty, a lot of that cost could be saved. The Pickering reactors should have been shut down quite a few years ago. They're past their best before date. And they could have been shut down quite a while ago had they made a deal with Quebec to buy the surface power at a cheaper rate.
Okay, thank you. And now we have a question from Lauren. Do you think that there is a way to solve the energy crisis using not only renewables, they undoubtedly have a part to play, but also nuclear? So is there not a way that we can make up the energy requirements using both? I mean, this is something that we hear a lot.
Yeah.
Gordon?
You hear a lot of this because it comes mostly from the nuclear proponents and from people who've been persuaded by the nuclear proponents. But the point is that nuclear and renewables are largely incompatible. As a matter of fact, as we see with the condition of Doug Ford, investing in nuclear means shutting down the renewables because nuclear can't afford to have those competitors. And as a matter of fact, some people may not know this, but there's been negative pricing in Ontario because the demand for electricity has diminished for over 10 years now in Ontario. And they, at one point, had to shut down the power from Niagara Falls in order to keep the nuclear reactors running, which is really insane. It's sort of like the Mad Hatter at the Tea Party, because it's more expensive to shut down the reactors and then have to start them up again than it is to just turn off the renewable flow of water from Niagara Falls. You can't turn off Niagara Falls, but you can turn off the generators. And so they have proven to be incompatible. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the Moltex literature, that's the stable salt reactor supplier, they say in their literature that the Moltex reactor is ideally designed to complement renewables because the renewables are intermittent, as we've talked about, and it needs some certain amount of storage. The Moltex reactor has a way of storing heat, very hot molten salt, and we're talking about hundreds of degrees, in special containers, and can use that power to fill in the valleys in renewable energy production. But you know, if you took that logic literally, it would imply that the first thing you should do is build the renewables, because what's the point of having a backup for renewables when you don't have renewables? So in order to be a backup for renewables, you have to start with the renewables. And what we're doing is we're standing the priorities on its head. We're investing in the slowest and costliest option, which may or may not even be viable in the long run, because none of these have been built or tested so far. And we have no idea whether they're going to. We do know that every one of them is going to be economically more expensive per unit of energy, per unit of electricity when they're built one at a time. There's no way that they can be cheaper. They're going to be more expensive, and consequently, they're going to be even less attractive than the large reactors. The only way they can overcome that difficulty of added expense because of the small size is to mass produce them. And that means they've got to have hundreds or thousands of customers, which they do not have. So it's highly problematic whether any of these reactors are actually going to be successfully deployed. Whereas with wind and solar and geothermal, we know it can be successfully deployed. There's no question about it. So we're bypassing the easy things, the low-hanging fruit, and we're concentrating on stuff that's pie in the sky. And I think that it's no accident that this comes from premiers who have traditionally wanted to kind of kick the can down the road when it comes to climate change.
Okay, I have another question here. So you claimed that small modular nuclear reactor technology will not be ready for years as an argument against its use. But also, it can also be claimed that the dependability of renewables is resolved with storage technology, but such storage technology is also not yet sufficient for present dependability needs. And likewise, hypothetical is the argument. How do you square one being a problem but the other not?
Well, I'm not trying to solve the problems of the universe, nor do I think I have all the answers. The point is, the experimental method is you try and see what happens. The point is, it seems clear that renewables can contribute. The renewables have contributed. Renewables have been very successful in various places. The price has gone down fantastically. And as I showed in the graph, the growth of renewables around the world surpasses the growth of any other energy source. So whatever the problems might be with renewables, there's problems with any energy technology, no doubt. But we should try it and see. Usually you find that when you start investing in something, you create a market, and that's what happened with renewables. The price goes down. The more you buy them, the more the price goes down. With nuclear, the more you buy them, the more the price goes up. That should tell you something. And also, to the extent at which we can get the storage technology going, everybody's talking about electrifying the transportation sector. It is impossible to electrify the transportation sector without breakthroughs in storage. So the more you invest in electrification and the more you invest in renewables, the more you're going to stimulate the storage. Storage has made great strides, and they're not using diesel generators as backups in California anymore. They're using Tesla batteries, and that's the way we should be going. Now, Tesla batteries may not be the be-all and the end-all, but we didn't even think Tesla batteries were possible until we started investing in them.
Okay, actually, the next question does relate to batteries. It's from
Yeah.
Tom. Grid-scale batteries require large amounts of lithium and cobalt. How does the mining, processing, and waste related to those elements compared to the environmental concerns of nuclear waste?
Well, that is a very good point, and it is true that there are some very dangerous materials involved in the rare metals, for example, the rare earths, as they call them, involved in renewable technology. And yes, that is a serious problem, and it does have to be dealt with. However, I'd like to point out that nuclear power is the only technology that actually creates new elements. They create hundreds and hundreds of new elements which never existed on Earth before 1939, which become their own problem over and above the natural elements that we already have. Now, lithium and cobalt are naturally occurring non-radioactive elements. And so it's true that we're using them. We did not create them. Nuclear industry is actually creating a whole galaxy of new problematic elements that have added dangers. Radioactive cobalt is a hell of a lot more dangerous than non-radioactive cobalt. Radioactive lithium is a hell of a lot more dangerous than non-radioactive lithium. These things are serious problems, and I'm not trying to minimize them. They do have to be looked at very carefully, and I think the disposal problem, storage problem for these elements is very important. But we did not create them, and we cannot destroy them. We have to deal with them. We should stop creating new problems, however, and that's what nuclear is doing.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question right now related to sort of the politics of what's going on right now, because we have Minister O'Regan, the federal minister, who spoke at the Canadian Nuclear Association conference about a week and a half ago, who said basically that the Trudeau government is going full speed ahead in nuclear. We have a premier here in this province who seems to be saying something similar. Certainly they're supporting the request of those two St. John companies for federal money. I think the figure on the table is $30 million they're asking for that project, and that's probably only the start.
Yeah.
So you've been in this a long time, Gordon. What would you suggest as a strategy to try and, I mean, these are huge forces right now who are pushing this thing. What would you suggest as a strategy?
Well, really, the push is really coming from the nuclear industry. The nuclear industry is the pusher. The government they're the target. If they can convince governments to pour public money into this for whatever reason, by portraying it, by misrepresenting its advantages and minimizing or even ignoring its disadvantages, the governments, I think, are being suckers. Because if the Wall Street and the banks will not finance this, what is it the role of the government to engage in venture capitalism of this kind? Is the government in a position to really assess the business merit, the business case for this whole situation? People who are in a position to actually measure the business case. Westinghouse, for example, dropped out of the small modular reactor market, saying that they did not see a business case for it. Also, the president of Exelon has said that he has not enthusiastic about small modular reactors for one simple reason: there's no customers. You can't have a business case with no customers. Now, I think that that the nuclear industry is desperately fighting to try and stay alive because they're going out. And as I portrayed earlier in the show, I think it's important to understand that background. Their nuclear renaissance was a flop. Now they're trying again, and they're trying desperately to get governments to pour money into this because that's the only place they can get the money. Now, UK has said that in 2017, the House of Lords did a report on this, and they expressed a lot of skepticism about the possibilities, also a lot of interest in the possibilities. But they said that 2030 would be the earliest that they could get even a prototype up and running. And that would, during that period of time, there would be absolutely zero contribution to climate change. There would be no reduction in greenhouse gases at all. In fact, it would be adding to greenhouse gases because enrichment plants, uranium enrichment plants, use as much energy as a large city, and they give off a hell of a lot of greenhouse gases, just like the tar sands do. We're going to be, for all the 10 years leading up to the first prototype being produced, we're going to be just adding to the problem and doing nothing to reduce greenhouse gases. That's not a strategy. I believe the government is doing this because they are politically in hot water. They can't stop the petroleum industry. They bought a pipeline. They're having difficulty getting that accepted by Native people and others. They're not cutting down on greenhouse gases like they said they were going to. They're going to be adding to it. We've seen in Ontario where the government is not going into renewables, they're going into refurbishing nuclear. So politically, it makes sense for the government to say, since we can't do a damn thing about actually fighting climate change, let's just say we're putting all our money behind nuclear and they're going to solve the problem. So they're basically passing the ball to the nuclear industry saying, okay, you haven't solved the problem in 80 years of radioactive waste or of climate change. Let's see if you can solve it now. But they are really relinquishing their role as leaders and saying, let's pass it over to the nuclear industry and let them lead.
Okay, well, we're going to draw this to a close.
One other thing I should.
Go ahead.
One other thing I should mention is that uranium, the uranium markets are dismal. The price of uranium is extremely low. Saskatchewan would love it if the uranium prices would rise a little. It's not going to rise unless you have more reactors. So pushing reactors can all, and there's a whole bunch of other political reasons why it's politically advantageous to, and people are mystified by nuclear. So if you just say, oh, the nuclear guys are going to fix it all, they're going to solve our climate change problem and so on. This is really, I think, a lack of leadership. It's political opportunism. And by the way, if you look at the mandate letter for Seamus O'Regan, you will see that there's not one word in his mandate letter about nuclear. Not one word.
Okay. This has been extremely informative and engaging, and I can't thank you enough for doing this in these circumstances. I think it's actually a bit of a bonus because now we get to record it in this fashion and share it with people who couldn't come. I would like to ask, I know you said that you were willing to share your slides, so we will make them available. We'll make them available through the Raven site, I'll put it that way, and possibly Council of Canadians as well. And we'll make the video available on a number of different archives. But where can people go? I think you have a list, Gordon. Yeah. If people, there's a number of activists on this call to stay informed about what's happening and get the latest updates. How do they do that?
Well, okay. I do what I can. I'm just a citizen like everybody else. I happen to be educated, well educated in science and technology, and so it allows me to play a useful role in just trying to demystify some of the scientific facts and like any citizen, comment on my opinions about what might or might not be politically viable or helpful. Um, but I think my main role is to try and be an interpreter, to try and demystify what some of the technology means, what radioactive wastes are, that sort of thing. I have a mailing list which anybody can sign on to if they want. My email address is ccnr@web.ca, and that's on the slideshow. And we have a website, www.ccnr.org, O-R-G, and I can send people a list of links to articles which are, for example, I went with a mission of chiefs, about 6 or 7 chiefs from Ontario Indigenous peoples down to the United Nations. We had a side event and we presented a video which is on the UN website. It will be for the next 3 years. And I can send links to those kind of resources that people can look at. And I'm not really an expert at all in alternative energy. Just like all of you, I'm a learner. I'm trying to find out as much as I can. This is not anything that I am a specialist in, but I do try and find out what works and what doesn't. And insofar as something seems to work, I'd like to pass it on. I realize that it's a very complicated, very intransigent problem. It's not at all a simple one. I don't think there are simple solutions, but I think it's relatively clear which direction we should be moving in.
Thank you again, Gordon. Everyone here in New Brunswick really appreciates what you've done for us tonight, and I'm sure we'll be staying in touch. Thanks very much. Bye,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thanks. And thanks very much to the sponsors. I really appreciate this. I know it takes a lot of planning and effort to do this, and I appreciate that.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.